The election of Donald Trump marked a decisive shift in world history. In the sphere of world relation, we've seen this with the signaling of a withdrawal of America from Europe and an attempt to strike a deal with Russia over Ukraine. Yesterday, as he stood there in front of the White House declaring Liberation Day and announcing a series of sweeping tariffs on almost all countries in the world, Trump took a sledgehammer to yet another one of the pillars of the post-World War era, namely globalization, which of all things can be said to have been the most important factor shaping the world as we know it in the past 8 decades. This is Against the Stream. My name is Hamid Alizadeh, and I'm here today with Fred Weston to discuss this particular issue, as well as the questions of Marine Le Pen's, being banned from standing in the French elections, and also the political evolution of the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK. But Fred, this is earth-shattering, isn't it?
Well, it's going to have a huge impact across the globe. It's going to seriously affect the economy, push it down, recession, companies are going to be in big trouble, and it's going to have a huge also political effect across the globe.
Yeah. I mean, just before we get into all of those things, I think just reading out what kind of tariffs Trump announced yesterday. We have a baseline tariff, which is a blanket tariff on all countries, which is 10% on all imports from all countries. And then he announced a series of individualized reciprocal higher tariffs on the 60 what Trump called the worst offenders, countries with which the U.S. says it has the largest trade deficit, i.e., America is buying more from these guys than they are from America. They range from everything from 10 to 50% on top of the existing 10%. Now, let's just see here. I got the list here. The EU, one of the world's largest markets, if not the largest consumer market in the world, but also one of the biggest producers of the world, a 20% tariff has been imposed. Huge thing. China has been hit with 34% tariff on top of an existing 20% tariff. So that's 54% on China, which is the second largest trading partner of America. The UK, we've been graciously kept to the 10% baseline levy. Then Japan, another important military and economic ally of the US over the past many decades, 24% tariffs. And then you have a whole series of Asian, Southeast Asian countries, Cambodia, 49%, Laos, 48%. More importantly, Vietnam, which is an important manufacturing economy where lots of American and Chinese companies have their production, 46%. And the list goes on. So this is, I mean, there's certain peculiarities of different countries. We can say that Russia has not been given any tariffs. Neither has North Korea or Belarus. And Trump says this because there are already so many sanctions. There's barely any trade anyway. You can say that about Iran as well, but nevertheless, Iran has been given the baseline 10% sanctions. Now, obviously, this is a huge shift from the whole of the previous period, where the dominant economic trend has been globalization, integration of different countries into the world market, incredibly complex and wide-ranging production lines, supply chains, covering many continents. And there's been an idea amongst the bourgeois themselves that globalization is a good thing. The bringing down of trade barriers is a good thing. America itself, in fact, in after World War II, campaigned around the world for the bringing down of trade barriers, for the bringing down of tariffs, and for the rise of, for the propping up of the world market. What does this represent? This shift compared to that, what does it represent?
Well, you see, free trade, genuine free trade, which doesn't exist, but genuine free trade, the nearest we got to it obviously was with globalization, the bringing down of tariffs globally. I mean, there were tariffs in different countries. The European Union is a customs union to protect itself.
Yeah.
But globally speaking, compared to previous periods, there was a high degree of free trade. Now, the problem is this. Free trade means genuine competition between companies to produce the best and cheapest products for the market. Those that can achieve that will obviously sell more. The most competitive industries will sell more, and the most competitive countries will export more. Now, Marx made the point that free trade, he didn't support one or the other in the sense that, we've discussed this in a previous discussion. But the one thing he said, the only reason he would come down on the side of free trade, because it accelerates the development of productive forces globally, and therefore creates the gravediggers of the capitalist system. That was the one progressive side to it. Now, in free trade allows the most competitive, obviously, to rise to the top. That means you have winners, but you also have losers. Now, both America and Britain and other countries, in their history, they've been both protectionist and free traders, depending on the period. The Americans became very big free traders from the Second World War onwards. Why? Well, they had the most advanced economy. They had the productive forces, they had the productivity, and they could outcompete. And therefore, they were interested in opening up the world economy. But since the Second World War, the United States has undergone a relative slow, sort of long-term decline. And I repeat relative because it's still number one, and China is coming up close behind. But it's not the absolute power in the economy that it was, say, 1945. It's lost a lot of ground because others have developed, in particular China, which has become the big competitor. And it's not by chance that he's imposed 34% on top of 20%, 54% on China. China is the number one competitor. But this, it's an indication, we've said it before, of the decline of the United States relative to other countries. And this is an attempt to bring back home industry and jobs. America has, in the recent years, attempted to do that in different ways. I mean, this is not the first time. Trump did it last time. He brought in tariffs. I'll give you an example. I think I quoted it before. Italian steel had a 25% tariff imposed on it because in the European Union in 2018.
Yes.
The result was that Italian exports of steel to the United States were halved, and they've stayed at that level. And that shows you the potential impact that these new tariffs can have across a whole swathe of industries in Europe and around the world. We've said it many times, protectionism is in effect an attempt to export your problems to other countries, i.e. export unemployment and import jobs. The idea is stop cheaper goods coming in so that we can stimulate investment in the United States. It's still a big market. And to a degree, that is happening in the sense that we've seen America receiving investment from outside. more than Europe, for example. Even European companies, German companies, they're looking at their own interests. And they're thinking, we need to have a productive plant in the United States in order to exploit that big market, because it's still a huge market. So there's an element of a shift of capital. Some are trying to do deals like, if we invest, you won't hit us with tariffs, this kind of thing. So it's a shifting of the problems. And it's like America first, thinking of our own. That's what Trump is saying. And he's saying that to the American workers. I'm going to bring back your jobs with these measures. But what it means, I mean, first of all, history shows that over time, it does not have that effect. It doesn't like bring all the jobs back. In this sector or that sector, you might get a bit. But what these tariffs do globally is massively slow down the world economy. World trade is slowed down massively. And let's not forget that the transatlantic trade, i.e. the trade between what are the two biggest markets in the world, the European Union, or Western Europe, let's say, and North America, the United States mainly, and Canada. That's the biggest trading partners, I say, globally. It's the biggest exchange of goods in the world. And to impose tariffs like this on Europe, which are now going to provoke retaliatory measures, that will happen. Inevitably, it always happens. It always provokes that, because you're trying to export your problems to us. We try and export them back to you. That's what it comes down to, basically. But the end result will be a general slowdown of the economy. In fact, I was looking at figures. The stocks of some important European banks have gone down 4, 5, 6, 7% after this news. Why? Because they're looking at the fact that the economy will slow down. They're expecting, therefore, interest rates to have to come down to keep the economy buoyant, which will affect the income of the banks. And they're losing on shit. This shows you, when you want to know how capitalists think, you look at where they're putting their money or where they're taking their money out of. So it's preparing a slowdown in the economy, which was already taking place. There was already the slowdown taking place. This is going to accelerate it. It could tip the economy over into a full-blown world recession. Memories of the 30s come back, when you think of this.
I mean, the Financial Times had an article, although I have to say, the Financial Times, everything they write that's related to Trump is heavily skewed to try to discredit everything that he's doing and present themselves as these overloads of reason and rationality.
Of course.
However, there is an interesting quote here. There's a Jun Du, a professor at economics at Aston University, has developed a model which says that if countries, I think he's looked at 130 countries, so if they impose a 25% tariff on each other, it would have a similar effect to the 1930s trade war that deepened the Great Depression. That was 10 years of massive economic decline, essentially. And they say that as it is now, both the American economy and the economies that Trump is attacking are going to be affected by this. However, America, because it's stronger, is going to be affected less. But if it came to a full-blown global trade war, America would actually experience the worst inflationary effect of any nation, because the American economy is tapped into the whole world. It's not kind of confined or cordoned off in any way. So what we're talking about is a potential major economic crisis coming out of this. But as you say, this is not a crisis that wasn't there before. You read the liberal news, they write about it as if Trump is mad. We were the people, like we were the good, rational, reasonable people in charge before. Now this idiot has come. He's throwing everything overboard. In reality, the economic policies that they were running for decades was complete madness, which was based on what? Which was based on massive debts.
Yes.
Stock market bonanzas, housing bubbles in every sphere you could possibly imagine. And without any thinking about tomorrow. And in fact, if we look at we'll get to France. There's a huge budget deficit in France. In Britain, we talked about it last week, massive budget deficits. Those are because of the economic policies of the past period, where the interest rates are now rising so much they're becoming the payment of interest debt servicing and interest rates are now the highest post on the budgets of major economies around the world. So that was actually what created the fragility of the world economy. But what Trump's policies will do is to push it over the edge. I mean, Britain is already in a recession. France and Germany were stagnant, just around going up and down around the recession point. And there are other countries, Italy and so on, that have much more fragile situations. These are major economies, and obviously being hit would also cause big, waves of problems for all over the world. Now, I wanted to comment on a couple of things. One is this question of, let me see what my notes here. This question of capitalism and protectionism in effect. We talked about this before, that capitalism often uses protectionist measures in its ascending period. In reality, what happens is that capitalism, as it came to the world, was very, very closely connected to the rise of the nation states. You had in the first capitalist revolution, the Dutch Revolution, the Dutch War of Independence against Spain. You had at the same time a coalescing of the Dutch states, and that created a capitalist domestic market that allowed for capital to develop. The English Revolution, the French Revolution. In Germany, the introduction of capitalism, or the proper development of capitalism, started with the unification of Germany in 1871, which, again, the creation of an internal market and allowed for big capital to develop, for manufacture, mass production to develop on a different scale, the removal of internal trade barriers between each city, each fiefdom. That was the remnants of feudalism that capitalism was fighting against. But as capital develops, as big business develops and industry develops within the national sphere, it immediately, very quickly reaches the limits, because every time the capitalists invest, they need a bigger market to sell their goods for. And therefore, the development of capitalism inevitably takes it beyond its own borders. And that's when we have the era of so-called free trade. The world markets begins to develop. We saw this in the post-war period. We've talked about this before. America being by far the most dominant and most advanced industrial country in the world, arguing for the lowering of trade barriers and tariffs, free trade for everyone. Why? Because they have a higher productivity. The productive forces, which means the industry, science, technique in America, was advanced to such a level that they could outcompete everyone else, and therefore lowering the trade barriers meant outcompeting the national industries and businesses of other countries. But what you actually have is that this is already breaking with capitalism, because the capitalist class itself is national, but it breaks free and capital itself wants to be international. You have multinational companies developing, you have huge conglomerates developing, looking for places to invest, looking for places to export capital. And for example, in the 90s, what we had there was the collapse of the Soviet Union, the opening up of China to the China moving towards capitalism, the opening up of the Chinese market, the further opening up of the Indian market. That gave a breath of fresh air into, at least of life, into the system, so to say. Again, capital developing in all of those areas, investing in those areas, using the cheap labor and the high-tech industries developed in the West. But then what you have is that in those areas, you begin to see development themselves. In particular, in China, you see development, but other places as well, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil. You begin to see the development to such an extent that at a certain stage, they begin to outcompete the West. And you have the development of China is now the second biggest economy in the world. And this process then, which capital basically trying to go beyond the boundaries of the nation state, looking for markets, meet another, barrier. Whereas from the point of view of humanity and from the point of view of the development of industry and the productive forces, there's no sense in having all of these trade barriers. But from the point of view of the individual ruling classes, and in China now you have the development of a powerful individual capitalist class, which competes with the American capitalist class, that becomes a barrier. That's why we as Marxists say that capitalism has two fundamental flaws. One is private property. The other one is the nation state. And in reality, what we see now with the rise of protectionism, Trump is just a personification of a trend that started way before him. I remember Alan Woods, who's been on this show, who's main theoretician of the Revolutionary Communist International, said many times we're entering a period of wars and protectionism, and economic protectionism, heightened tensions between the classes, which is precisely this, that the world market is becoming too narrow for the existence of all of these different capitalist classes and the maintenance of their interests. I can see you picked up some papers. You got some facts and figures there.
Well, I'm preparing a lead-off for Congress I have to go to soon on world perspectives, and I've been collecting lots of material. And some of it is on this, obviously. What you were saying about the nation state, the world market, etc. See, capitalism develops on a national basis initially, from a very low level, obviously. In the early days in Holland, in England, and other countries. It establishes a national market, but the nature of capitalism is to constantly invest and reinvest to stay in the market, to compete. It tends to increase generally productive capacity, and that goes beyond the national market, and therefore they need to open up markets outside. Marx explains this in the Communist Manifesto. He says it goes, every corner of the globe is brought into the system. Now, this implies at a certain point, obviously, the opening up of the world market, the development of productive forces. So long as there's a market, there will be investment and there will be development. But at a certain point, the contradictions of the system appear, i.e. the ability to produce far more than the market can absorb, even on a global scale. And what you have is the beginning of overproduction. I was looking at some figures. Overproduction today is expressed in another term, which is overcapacity, i.e. you have far more productive capacity than you can actually utilize to sell your goods. I was looking at a graph on the United States from the 1970s up till today. And it has its ups and downs, obviously. I may have quoted this before. But if you look at the trend, you draw a line through it, you see a gradual reduction in the utilization of capacity in the United States. I mean, that's the graph.
I can say for our listeners and viewers, it starts from around 90% in the 1970s, and then gradually declines to around 76 or 7.
Yeah,
significant decline.
That's right. And if you look at it, the
capacity
utilization has gone down in America. In Europe, it's about 77%. In America, it's about 78, close to it. China is about 76%. All of them have overcapacity, which means that in order to exploit to the maximum the productive forces they have, they need to export more. not everybody can export more in the world market. It has its limits. That is explaining what is going on now with the tendency towards protectionism. When the cake stops growing, your slice of the cake, to get bigger, you've got to cut somebody else's slice, and that is what Trump is trying to do. Now, you were talking about China, India, all these countries. These were brought into the world market. You could say with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe was sucked into the world market. Russia was brought in eventually. India, which was always capitalist but had high tariffs, was forced to lower its tariffs in the 90s, open up its market. And China entered the world market. It joined the World Trade Organization, for example. And if you see in the period of the upswing, the post-war upswing, and the decades that followed, there was a tendency to greater and greater, coordination of the world market, opening up. For instance, the very European Union was a bringing together of countries in Europe, which eliminated completely tariffs between them. It was complete free trade within the European Union, obviously. But you also had NAFTA in North America, Canada, the United States, Mexico making a deal, a similar type of deal. You had similar Mercosur in Latin America. Everywhere there was a tendency to create bigger markets. In effect, what they were trying to do was to go beyond the limit, overcome the limits of the national market and go beyond the limits of the system itself by opening up bigger and bigger markets. Even when they got, the World Trade Organization is an example of an attempt to coordinate the market globally. But as I was saying earlier on, this has its limits because within this, you see, capitalism, it's a system based on private property and the driving force is profit. Making greater and greater profits. The more profits you make, the more capital you have to invest, to stay in the market, i.e., to update your productive capacity, to update your techniques, to become the most productive, therefore the most competitive. If you start to lose out on profit and your capital goes down and you have less to invest, then you're going to start losing out. The new technology comes in, somebody else will get it, they will use it, they will be very productive, very competitive, you will start to lose out. And there's a shift in the balance between countries. And some countries rise and others fall. This has been the case throughout the whole history of capitalism. Britain declined as America emerged as this big power in the 20th century. America has gone through a similar process in the recent period, and China has risen. This is what's happening. In a situation like this, you can't expect free trade to hold forever. The pressure is going to grow for those that have the muscle. What America is doing under Trump is there are two big markets. The two biggest markets, in effect, are North America and Europe. China's two big export markets are these two parts of the world. In fact, the exchange between the two areas, the transatlantic trade, is the biggest exchange globally. There's a massive trade going on between these two blocks. But China's come in and has become much more advanced. I've got the figures for productivity, for example. If you look at the figures for productivity, Europe's productivity has practically stagnated to almost zero. American productivity is slower than it used to be in the past, but in the recent period, it's actually increased. I've got some figures here. Look, between the fourth quarter, this is the European Central Bank Economic Bulletin, between the fourth quarter of 2019 and the second quarter of 2024, labor productivity per hour worked increased by 0.9% in the euro area, almost stagnant, whereas it increased by 6.7% in the United States. The US in the last few years has actually been making a big effort to catch up, to rebuild, in effect, its industrial apparatus, which it lost in the previous year. Of course, if you look at the figures for China, China's productivity, say in 2021, grew by 9%. It's slowed down a little bit, but it's still growing by 4 or 5%. And if you look at the last 10, 15 years, Chinese productivity has grown between 7 and 9% per year, much higher even than America over that period, and far, far higher than Europe. This has to have a consequence at a certain point. The growing productivity makes you stronger, you export more, you make more profits, you increase your capital,
Yes.
and you have the resources to become more competitive. But this has an effect. It destroys industry in other parts of the world. So free trade develops the productive forces globally, but in the process it destroys them in certain parts of the world. And those who are feeling that are going to have problems at home in terms of jobs, in terms of the social conditions, in terms of the resources to spend on education, on pensions, etc., which forces the ruling class of those countries to attack their own working class. Now, as I said before, when you can reach a limit where that seriously destabilizes your society. That a capitalist class to govern does need to sit on top of a mass of millions of working people who are producing, and they must be able to give those millions of people a reasonable existence, a reasonable life, a reasonable wage. That allows for the system to maintain stability.
Yes.
Once that starts to be broken down, once those workers that were accustomed to those wages start seeing the jobs destroyed, the industries destroyed, the factories closed, and then the ones that open up are more precarious jobs, flexible jobs, longer hours, lower wages, etc., it starts to have a political effect. It starts to destabilize the system. So each ruling class, in effect, tries to stabilize its home front, but it can only do so by destabilizing that of the others. And what Trump is attempting to do is this. He wants to stabilize the home front. He wants to force countries to invest in America. Part of this is protectionism. We know Trump. Some of it is, let's see if somebody comes forward and says, I'll make a deal.
Yeah.
I'll invest so much in America if you take the tariffs off. Trump will say, okay, how much? So many billions. Oh, that means a new plant in this town or that place, whatever. He can then say, look, I've delivered on this front. But you see, the market is what it is globally. And if you shift capital from one area to another, what is created in one place will be destroyed somewhere else. So it doesn't stabilize the system as a whole. It might temporarily produce some results in the United States, of course.
Yeah.
But for instance, it's going to massively destabilize Europe. The figures I was giving here on productivity show that of the two big markets, let's say, as I said, North America and Europe, the process of decline in Europe is much sharper. The productivity is practically stagnant, and the European economy is going to feel the full weight of Trump's protectionism. There's another element you've got to add to here. By hitting China, see, the difference between China and Europe is this. China has a powerful economy. It has become the second economic power on the planet,
Yes.
right? Moving close to America. And it's growing still. It's slowed down, relative to the past, but it's still growing at about 5%.
Yeah.
Any country in Europe would think 5% would be marvelous. It solves all our problems. China is growing, has a powerful apparatus. A large part of its GDP is industry, i.e. the production of real goods, the production of actual real value. And it's very competitive. It has a very modern industry, and it's exporting globally. Now, if its share of the American market is cut back, China is going to look elsewhere. It's already doing it, by the way.
Yeah.
It's putting pressure on countries like Indonesia and others.
Yeah.
China is going to look to replace what it's losing in America, in Asia, Southeast Asia, especially. But think about it. Europe is the other market. The Chinese will look to increase their sales to, which will also hit Europe. It'll be a second hit And Europe, in fact, the discussions they're all having is, they also need to increase their protectionism to protect themselves against the Chinese, for example. That's the effect it will have. It will also lead to surprisingly new partnerships. Let's put it this way. I mean, China and Japan were historically considered enemies. Now Japanese are tending to play it down, but there's clearly been negotiations. There's been talks.
There was the first meeting. I don't know for how many years between Japan, South Korea, and China.
That's
took
right.
place last week.
Yeah.
To discuss how to deal with Trump's tariffs.
That's right.
Japan is Japan has received a 24% on top of the 10% tariffs, so 34% in total, which is a devastating blow to the Japanese economy, and therefore, as you said, this could actually end up giving China a bigger influence in Asia and weaken American influence in Asia, which is the opposite of what Trump
I don't think
wanted.
he realizes the more long-term effects of this. You see, you close up your market, you force everybody else to look for alternatives, right? And that means when you're trying to actually break down, for instance, you can see clearly that the thinking of Trump is break Russia away from China, bring it away, make a deal, for instance, over the Ukraine. But if he continues with these policies, it's in the interests of all the others to come closer together, to collaborate. A realignment, let's say, of even trading partners globally, which in the end could be detrimental to the Americans, because at the end of the day, you're not actually solving the fundamental contradictions of the system globally.
Yeah, it's just to round up this topic. It is quite paradoxical. That's the paradox of capitalism, that you have all of these immense productive capacities. You have industry, high-tech industry, distribution, technology, science, on unprecedented levels for mankind. The productivity of mankind has never been higher. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's precisely because of this. Rather than solving the world's problems with this, as you say, we have 22% under capacity overcapacity in manufacture. Instead of using that to solve the problems of humanity, what you actually have is the opposite.
Yes.
You have the whole system going into a crisis. It's like a child that's outgrown his clothes but keep wearing it. Mm-hmm. That is actually what's happening here. Trotsky makes this point. He's talking about World War II. But what he's really talking about is a rise of tension between nations in a period of capitalist crisis.
Yes.
Which is actually the rebellion of the productive forces against the straitjacket of the nation state. In reality, it's the productive forces of humanity that's developed to such a level, just like the productive forces developed during feudalism became too small for the local particular state, organization of the feudal society. Today's capitalist production has become too big for the capitalist nation state. And obviously it can only be solved with a socialist revolution by creating actually a world, using this world division of labor for the good. Instead, what you actually have now is, as you say, you have this reciprocal attacks on each other. But obviously, production today is so advanced that you cannot go back. That you can't roll time back. Trotsky actually also talks about like going back to the amoeba, to the stage of amoeba, to the early stages of capitalism. But today, if you look at a mobile phone, there's components in there. First of all, the material, the raw material comes from all over the world. It's been processed on a wide range of continents. Then it's been built, then it's been assembled. It's been around the world many, many, many times. To think that it's even possible to move all of that into the United States or any particular individual country is completely utopian. And it's reactionary because what it really does is that it destroys the productive forces. It destroys production. It destroys labor productivity, the efficiency, the mastery of mankind over nature. And it brings to the fore the acute need to break with this system, which it does. And on the other hand, it also creates, as you were talking about, the conditions for that in terms of pushing the working class. The European workers are the first ones to have to pay for this. Well, actually, the workers of the less advanced countries, Africa, Middle East, and so on, they're going to pay a heavy price for this. But the European workers are going to pay a huge price as well. It's going to lead to massive political and economic crises around Europe. But sooner or later, this will also come to America. Whether it's not clear to me whether it will be immediate or not, because you could have a situation where Trump actually attracts a series of investments. But regardless, because of the breakdown of world trade, because of the breakdown of the world market essentially into different spheres, and therefore you will see a lowering of productivity, a rise of prices, of components, of raw materials. Trade is going to become more expensive, and the only alternative will be local production, which is going to be less efficient, less advanced than the global division of labor which is created now. That's the world we're moving in towards. And yeah, if you want to have the last, because we have to continue to the next segment as well.
There's an old joke, I think it was, the joke is about Fords, where the boss is showing the shop steward all the new robots. And he has a go at the shop steward, and he says, "You see all these? See if you can get them to join your union, right? They're robots."
Yeah.
And the shop steward thought about it for a moment, and then he said, "Yeah, you got a point. But tell me, how many cars do these robots buy?"
Yeah.
Now it's a joke, but it brings home a point. You need workers with wages to spend money, to buy goods.
Yeah.
The protectionism, let's say in an ideal world for Trump, it actually works to its maximum, i.e. all the jobs are brought back to America and there's full employment. It would be at the cost of destroying jobs across Europe, across Asia, right? Well, if you did that, America would have such a huge, it already has massive excess capacity. If you massively did that, it would increase massively its productive capacity. It would have to sell abroad. It would have to sell massively abroad to maintain the jobs in America on a capitalist basis.
Yeah.
If you destroyed the purchasing power of millions of workers around the world with these policies, you can't square the circle here.
Yeah.
You can't destroy jobs here and then bring them here and say, right, now we're going to sell to those workers over there.
Yes.
They've lost their jobs.
Yeah.
Italian workers, French workers, Spanish workers, their purchasing power would be so much reduced by the effects of this that it could not work. It would actually affect the American workers eventually, which brings home the point. The technology that we have, think about it. If we have about 20%, 25% capacity that's not utilized, in theory, you could significantly reduce the working week. Everybody could be working 4 days a week instead of 5 and producing the same amount. In theory, you could massively reduce it, which would be the logical thing, a rational thing from a human point of view. The technology should be to save on labor, to save time, allow us to have greater time, more time for ourselves. The application of this technology, we're not against technology. We're in favor of the most advanced technology. But it can only be fully utilized in a planned economy where the profit of the individual and the interests of this individual nation state no longer exist. Yes. And you have full international cooperation, which would increase the wealth of humanity overall and reduce the necessary amount of labor in which you achieve that. But that cannot be achieved on a capitalist basis. That's why the argument for socialism is not just an ideal, we would like to have a fairer system. It is actually the only way humanity can actually move forward in the next epoch.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on then to the next point on the agenda. Some other elements were standing in the way of the advancement of humanity. The political class. We have seen in the last period a series of political, how do we say, interventions in different countries. We saw in Romania, Iorescu, who was a candidate, who was an anti-NATO candidate for the presidential elections. He was a far-right person that no one really expected would win. Suddenly, he won the first round of the elections, and the Romanian authorities canceled the elections, the whole of the elections, on very, very spurious grounds, with the full backing of the EU bureaucracy, by the way. We've seen in Turkey, we'll get to that, but in Turkey we've seen the banning of Imamoglu, who's the main leader of the CHP, the main opposition party. He's been banned from standing. And this has been criticized by the EU, obviously, although they haven't gone as far as to actually do anything about it because they're having good deals with Erdogan. They tried with Trump. I'm sure he's guilty of all of the charges that were brought against him, but it was clear that none of them were for actual legal reasons. But they tried to bar him. They tried to put him in prison and bar him from standing, essentially. They didn't succeed. And now they have come for Marine Le Pen, who is the leader of Rassemblement National, a right-wing conservative party in France, which has grown massively in popularity in the past few years on the basis of, they're based on, part of their thing is against immigrants and so on, but they connect that to the attacks on the working class, austerity. They're against the EU, they're against the Ukraine war, and they've come out strengthened. You were telling me before, according to the latest opinion poll, Le Pen was standing to get 37% of the vote if there were elections today. But now that's all been, how do you say, a spanner has been thrown into the works of that, because she has been sentenced, given a suspended prison sentence of 4 years, 2 years of suspended sentence, and 2 years with an ankle bracelet at home. She's been fined 100,000 euros for misappropriation of public funds. Now, the case against her is actually quite flimsy, if I have to say. She was a member of the European Parliament, and she hired 2 assistants. As you would, as a MEP, you would be allowed to hire 2 assistants. But these 2 assistants worked for her party rather than for her office. That's the basics of the case. But this means that, first of all, because she's been convicted, she's now barred from standing in any elections for the next 5 years. And in fact, in France, that's a law. If you're convicted, you can't stand in elections. But you see, you can choose whether that counts from now or after the appeal process, because she's appealed this. But the ban stands from now, which means that she cannot stand in the 2027
That's right.
elections. The way I see it, we don't agree with Marine Le Pen.
No.
She's a bourgeois politician. Politically, we have nothing in common with her. But it's clear what's happening here. This has nothing to do with the law. Just to say, according to the NGO called Transparency International, 26 ministers in the Macron government have been in this period in power have been involved implicated in corruption cases.
Yes.
Right. So there's a double standard here. French politics is full of corruption scandals, and what she's been convicted of is something which probably most parties are doing one way or another. This has nothing to do with following the law, the so-called independence of the judiciary. This is clearly a political attack. It's a persecution. And not only is it an attack on Le Pen, who is a bourgeois politician who obviously threatens the interests of the government. You know, she on the one hand, she stands to take down Macron, but also the EU bureaucracy must feel very threatened by her, to have someone like her right at the heart of the EU.
Yes.
She's not keen on continuing the whole Ukraine adventure, which again, a lot of strong interests are vested in that. And they just decided to get rid of it. And not only that, but millions of people vote for her. Millions of working class people support her for whatever reasons. I don't think they realize their interests are not aligned. I don't think they realize fully what she stands for, that she doesn't stand for the interests of the working class. But nevertheless, they support her. And this is in effect a disenfranchisement of that segment of the French ruling class. You're not voting. We have full democracy as long as you vote for the people we like. And if you don't, we're just going to kick them out.
That's right.
And then they talk about totalitarianism and Trump being a fascist and a Bonapartist and this and that. What do you think, Fred?
Well, you see, the previous discussion we just had about the impacts of these tariffs, as I said, this is going to sharpen the contradictions inside Europe.
Yes.
One, between the classes, which are already sharpening. And two, it will also create conflicts between the different powers. But you see, this shift, the political shift that's taking place in Europe, is a consequence of, we've said it in other podcasts, because the left is so weak, in some countries practically non-existent, and when it does exist, it hardly distinguishes itself from the liberal bourgeois. Look at Britain. Starmer is carrying out a policy that could easily be carried out by the Tories. So because there's no clear outlet on the left, what we're seeing is this phenomenon of this right-wing populism. Trump is obviously the biggest example of this, but Le Pen represents a similar phenomenon. The guy in Romania, he was on the same political position, more or less. The AfD in Germany, what we're having is these right-wing populists. Countries like France and Germany are key countries in Europe. Now, the Europeans have this policy. This is not the place to discuss Ukraine, but we can see their policy is rearmament, become strong, face up to Russia, help Ukraine. This is a policy. The European peoples have paid a big price for this in energy costs and other effects. The German economy has massively been hit by this. The German working class is suffering as a consequence of the Ukraine war. That explains why the AfD is growing. Now, when these forces, they're nationalist, right-wing forces, but for instance, they question all the spending on the Ukraine war, for these figures to emerge victorious in elections in some key European countries would upset actually the plans and the policies, let's call it the liberal bourgeois establishment in Europe. It would change that radically. And they're struggling against that. They're basically trying to stop the tide coming in. When I was looking at this, I was thinking of, the legend. It's the legend of the King Canute. Sat in a chair on the beach, and some people think it was to stop the tide. In actual fact, it was to show that you can't stop the tide. But I feel like Macron is trying to stop the tide coming in. And the European ruling classes are trying to stop this wave which is coming, which is a polarization of society, which for a period of time will express itself through a phenomenon similar to Trump. They're going to get a lot of mini Trumps in Europe. They don't like the idea of this happening because it goes against the policies they're trying to carry out.
It takes the bread out of their mouths.
Now, these are right-wing nationalists. They will promote reactionary policies racist policies, all the rest of it. But because the left isn't giving an answer, and I remember in the 70s in Britain, it was the left that supported protectionism. The debate in the Labour Party in the 70s was the left reformists were defending protectionism to protect jobs at home. So as you can see, the protectionism is neither a left nor a right-wing policy. It depends on the interests of the class at a certain point in time. But they're trying to stop this wave. And you can see they blocked the elections in Romania. Now they've removed the main opposition candidate to Macron. As I was saying, there was an opinion poll published at the weekend which showed that 37%, I think up from 31 to 37%, which if confirmed in the elections would be the biggest vote, I think, in the first round for a leader for a very long time. They desperately don't want that to happen. Now, you see, on the question of the legalities of it, okay, I've seen people saying, yes, but you've got to look at the fact that she did commit a crime. It's a criminal thing, see? Now, if we want to take the discussion down to that level, that would be lowering the level to an incredible degree.
Yes.
Because technical illegalities, I tell you, you investigate any major political party,
You can find it.
and you will find some technicality that you can get them on, right? In the recent period, Trump had lots of cases against him, right? They tried to destroy him by using the courts. Now, and if you looked at each individual case, I'm not the judge to judge each case. They may have been true, they may have been false, there may have been exaggerations. The point is not that. The same thing happened, in Italy for years. Berlusconi was in one trial after another. And I remember talking to people. The effect it had was not, what a terrible thing. I mean, obviously the people on the left who never would vote for the right, obviously would be scandalized, but a lot of ordinary working class people. I got friends that I would speak to, and they would condemn the judges, not Berlusconi, because they saw it as a political act, right?
Which it is.
Romania, it's the same thing, right? Now, in France, what you're going to have is a section of the population will say, this is a political maneuver. And then they're not inventing it, it's the truth. Because whatever you think of Le Pen, I mean, we're not here to campaign for her. She's an enemy of the working class. Our task is to show that, reveal that to the working class as much as possible. But we should also understand, within the confines of bourgeois democracy, what they've done is not very democratic. Even look, Mélenchon, right, on the left, has actually said one right thing. He says, this is in French, the decision to remove an elected representative should be in the hands of the people.
Absolutely.
Right? So what he's saying is you're using legal measures to remove a candidate that is of concern to you. And the effect it's going to have on a lot of people is, you see, they don't want her. And what it will do, I'm convinced of this, it will actually strengthen her politically.
Of course.
Now they're speculating. The clever guys, they're discussing, yes, but Bardella's young. He's not so experienced. He might not get the same vote. I think this is one of their calculations. Le Pen has 37%. Bardella might not get that, you see. So we've got a chance of squeezing them out again at the last election. Remember that last time they had a front which went from the left to the centre, a united front to stop Le Pen. Look at the effect it's had. She's gone up in the polls since then. Why? Well, all the others, in one way or another, are collaborating to carry out a policy of austerity and attacks on the working class. Nothing good is coming from this. I can remember when in Nigeria, back in 1998, the military dictatorship was about to collapse. And in 1999, it collapsed. I remember reading one article quoting ordinary poor people on the streets of Nigeria, asking them about democracy. And one of the people, you know what they said? Democracy, is that something you can eat? I.e., does it give me bread? Does it feed my family? Yes or no? That's an ordinary working person's view of it. The bourgeois liberals look at it now from the pure point of pure bourgeois democracy. But bourgeois democracy is breaking down because it's okay as long as it delivers what they want. In Britain, so long as it's the Tories and then a right-wing Labour, then democracy's fine. The winner wins and governs. Why? Because whoever governs, the programme is decided by the high officials in the ministries, the permanent bureaucrats, the representatives of the ruling class. The programme is written long before they get elected. You come in, you continue with the same programme. Privatisations continue, cuts continue, etc. That's the programme they have decided. When somebody comes in that might upset their plans in a serious way, they did it with Corbyn. Corbyn they saw as a threat because they understood the Tories will lose, Labour will win. We can't have a left-wing Labour, we've got to have a right-wing. So they destroyed him. Here, through the courts, they have moved to remove the candidate that has the biggest opportunity of defeating the present outfit. And the reason they've done it, we shouldn't fall to the level of the technical illegality or not of this or that, whatever they did. It's to understand why now and why Le Pen. Because I'm sure that in this French parliament, there's a lot of MPs that you could find stuff on.
I'll tell you, if this had been Iran or Russia, you would have had a whole different set of headlines coming out in the media. You would have a media that would be complete up in arms, in a frenzy. The word independent judiciary has been used a lot in French politics nowadays, and obviously, what this actually shows more than anything is the absolute lack of any independence of the judiciary. The judiciary, the state apparatus, is an extension of the ruling class. That's what it's a tool of the ruling class and the ruling establishment. And that's what they're using it now. In ordinary times, most of the time, they try to provide a semblance of neutrality. Although even then, it's always skewed to big business over the working class. However, when they need it, when they feel their core interests are under threat, which they believe, because Macron could really cause a big crisis in the EU. The whole EU apparatus, this massive bureaucratic monster, is under threat. Their interest in Ukraine, which they have a lot of vested interests, which has nothing to do with Ukraine, but their own interests are at stake. And they just want to stop her. Now, we have an article on our website, marxist.com. We'll link it in the description. A very good article by our French comrades. And tomorrow we'll have another article about this, by the way, by Alan Woods, also on marxist.com. So everyone should go in and read that. And when I'm talking about tomorrow, I'm talking about Friday, the 4th of April. But the French comrades describe how a series of people on the left are actually cheering on the courts for stopping Le Pen, because they say that she's a fascist and she's a far right and reactionary. First of all, she's not a fascist, but she is definitely a reactionary. She's an enemy she's the class enemy of the working class. However, the reason why Le Pen has gotten the popularity that she has is that she has been portraying herself as an anti-establishment character, i.e., in a situation where there's massive attacks, decades of continuous attacks against living standards of the living standards of the French workers, cuts in social spending, attacks on pensions, and all sorts of other things. Le Pen has been outside. Most of the left has been implicated, although Mélenchon has not been implicated. That's the only, you can give him kudos for that. He's not been that as implicated in all of this stuff as the left and the rest of the world has. Le Pen has not been implicated. She's been criticizing it from outside with an anti-establishment rhetoric. And she's been calling out a lot of the things that the traditional left never does. And that these guys who are now cheering on her don't do. And she's been calling out the establishment, the elite, all of that stuff, the corruption and so on, just in a similar way to Trump. Which is why a lot of people, out of desperation and anger and resentment against the establishment, have swung towards her.
Yes.
Now, in this situation, for the left to come and defend the establishment, there we see the exact reason for the rise of Le Pen.
Of course.
You have the establishment, which controls the economy, which controls the big banks and industries, which control the state apparatus, the police, the education system, every single day coming down harder on the working class, exploiting it, squeezing more blood out of it. And you have the left aligning behind it in defense of so-called democracy. And the fascists are coming, the fascists are coming. When the real enemy is having its go at the working class. Yes. They're cutting itself. You have to give it to Mélenchon. Mélenchon has, we have serious criticism of Mélenchon, but in this situation, he came out, as you say, he said, it's the French working class who should decide, not Le Pen. And then he went on to criticize Le Pen. Of course, there are other criticisms that we have of it, but I think in this, he was actually better than most of the left internationally.
Well, something on it. I found a interesting little bit of news here from 2019. Mélenchon was facing a similar accusation.
Yeah.
You see, there was a time in which Mélenchon...
And he will probably in the future.
...seemed to be the emerging candidate that could defeat the centre from the left. They were investigating exactly the same thing. I was reading the article. It was about the use of European parliamentary funds for party activities, right? So they're not accusing them of pocketing money personally. No. They're accusing them of using the money for the party activities. Now, they didn't. This shows that just as they're using it against Le Pen now, the judiciary would be prepared to use the same powers and the same methods against Mélenchon or against any promising left candidate that risk disturbing their plans. Let's put it that way. You see, to applaud the judiciary is absurd from the left. They are part of the state. The judiciary is part of the state apparatus. And the state apparatus is there to defend the interests of the ruling class, of the capitalist class, right? In this case, there is a dominant wing, the dominant bourgeois liberal wing, let's say, of the French ruling class and Europe, which wants to stop, as I said, the tide that's coming. They want to stop these people coming in. And they are using these methods with a very thin veneer of legality behind which they hide. But when in actual fact, it's actually undermining even the very meaning of democracy. The fact that apparently in France, I think the majority of people in opinion polls say democracy is not working.
61% say that French democracy is flawed.
It's flawed. It's not working.
And here we have the so-called socialists and the left lining up behind that flawed democracy.
But can I just, a little anecdotal thing. I was talking to one of our comrades in France who said he had some friends in a town, very working class town. I don't remember the town now, but I think it had in the old days, it had a Citroën plant. It was a bit like Detroit, Michigan. The car industry, the good jobs that went with it. They've been destroyed, okay? So you've got these working class families that the old secure jobs have gone. And he was invited, it was a social gathering. He was invited to some party or other. And he was speaking to these people and they were very open. And they said, we're going to vote Le Pen. And he asked why. He said, look, we know she's I'm not going to quote the word. They used quite a bit they insulted her. They know that she's what she is. She's this, that, or the other. But we just want to give those other guys a kick. Right? That's what they said. We're going to vote for her because we want to give the other guys a good kick because they deserve it, because we hate all of them, right? I think that expresses the success behind Le Pen. It also expresses the complete lack of an alternative. It should be somebody on the left that's getting that working class vote to give a kick to all the others. The problem is the left is protecting them from being kicked. And they're actually they're part of the party. They're enjoying they're at the top with these people. Instead of being among the people, among the working class people and representing them with a revolutionary position,
Yeah.
They should be denouncing the judiciary because as they've used it against Le Pen today, tomorrow they will use it against against a left candidate.
Yeah.
And for the left to do this, it's ridiculous. They're not looking at their own future.
In fact, they talk about Le Pen as the main enemy. But if you look at the last French budget, which was pushed through by the present government, it actually led to the collapse of one government, but by the present regime, let's say, it contained 53 billion euros worth of cuts and tax hikes. We talked about it in one of the previous episodes. They're now talking about raising military spending from 2.1 to 3% of GDP. That's another $30 billion euros a year in savings. There is a all-out attack on the living standards of the French people, and which has been taking place for a number of years. This is a war against the working class. And that's what all of that anger that you talk about is based in. And instead of taking up guns against the ruling class, these leftists align with it against Le Pen. We have to give credit where credit is due. Mélenchon is a left reformist, but in words, he has not been as implicated as the left in other places of the world. Although he has limitations because he talks a good talk.
Well, they made that deal.
But then, exactly.
To stop Le Pen at all costs.
Yeah, exactly. But unless you have anything else, I think we should.
Well, just a little reminder.
Yeah.
Who raised the age of retirement in France from 62 to 64? Was it Le Pen?
Exactly.
I think it was a guy called Macron.
Yeah.
And do you remember the reaction of the French working class? What a marvelous movement across the whole of France. A huge protest against that. But it passed nonetheless. They used the special powers the president has, the decree powers that he has, against the democratic institutions, you could say, right? They imposed a policy which is going to hit the French working class. That anger and that movement should have found an expression in a genuine workers' party giving a lead. Mélenchon partially expresses it.
Yes.
But then because of that deal, he made a deal with the socialists and with the others, in effect saving them. Because without the deal with Mélenchon, they wouldn't have got into parliament. They got into parliament, and the first thing they started doing was discussing how to carry out a policy independent of Mélenchon, obviously, and make a deal with the centre.
Yeah.
This is the.
It just doesn't look serious when it does things like that.
That's right.
And because of this wavering, Mélenchon is on the rise. Because of the support of the state and of the establishment by the left, Le Pen. I'm talking about Le Pen. Le Pen is on the rise. So ironically, it's precisely this obsession with fighting Le Pen over anyone else. A lesser evilism, saying that our present regime is a lesser evil than Le Pen. That is what's creating the rise of Le Pen. When the main enemy is still sitting there in his castle, shooting down and carrying out the policies.
That's right.
Okay, we can go on and on about this,
yes.
But we'll get back to it again in the future. I think we need to continue to the next point, which is the PKK. Now, the PKK is the Kurdish Workers' Party. Started in Turkey at the end of the 70s, early 80s, and gradually it was a guerrilla organization. It engaged in guerrilla warfare against the Turkish state, and gradually became the main dominant political force amongst the Kurds in Turkey. Later on, it spread into the Kurdish areas of Syria. Again, it became the dominant wing. And it has a significant influence amongst the Kurds in Iraq and in Iran as well, although there it's not nearly as strong as in Syria and Turkey. In Syria, the Syrian wing of the PKK, or the wing of the umbrella organization that the PKK set up, is called the KCK actually. They de facto, after the Syrian revolution, ended up with power in their hands. They set up this autonomous area called Rojava that many people on the left would know about. Inside of Turkey, they've been fighting. There's been since 2015, there's been a one-sided civil war against the Kurds, and in particular against areas where the PKK is strong. Nevertheless, the PKK has thrived because it has a strong authority amongst lots of Kurdish people, but also lots of Turkish and young people and workers all around the world for being a left-wing radical socialist organization. In particular, their successes in Syria, where they became the most effective fighting force against ISIS, really brought that home. But also in Turkey, the PKK affiliated organizations such as the HDP, which was the Kurdish political, all Turkish national organization, which was heavily influenced by the PKK, gained a huge support, and at a certain point in 2014, I believe, it gained more than 13% in the polls. It became a real threat to the rule of Erdogan, actually, and it began to become a focal point for the dissatisfaction and anger of young people in all of Turkey, not just in the Kurdish areas. Now, on the 27th of February, Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, who's been in prison since 1999, made a declaration where he called for the guerrillas to lay down their arms, essentially, disarm themselves. He sent a letter, and he said, history and our people demand from us a democratic solution and peace that align with the spirit of the time. He also wrote that he sees it as both necessary and historic to hold a congress to end this armed struggle against the Republic of Turkey, which has lasted for nearly 40 years, and to determine the political and social strategies and tactics in according with the spirit of the new era. With this Congress, a new era begins. In this period, we are entering a phase where within the Republic of Turkey, we will live together in peace and fraternity as a democratic society with a democratic identity based on free and equal constitutional citizenship. Thus, we have to move beyond the conflict-ridden past of the 90-year history of the Republic and walk toward a future built on truce, peace, and the universal criteria of democracy. This, in effect, is an end of the PKK as we know it. Mm-hmm. And it's quite, striking that this is happening at a moment where Turkey is heating up for massive class struggles. In the past 2 weeks, we've seen hundreds of thousands, millions of people taking the streets because the main opposition candidate, Imamoglu, his name is the candidate of the CHP, was barred from standing by Erdogan. At first, his university degree was invalidated, which means that by law he can't stand if you don't have a degree. And then he was charged with certain corruption charges, pretty much like Le Pen is.
The Turks are learning from the French.
Exactly, yeah, or the French are learning from the Turks. They did it first.
Yeah.
But and millions of people are coming out against Erdogan. Young people from all around over the world, working class people in all areas of Turkey, in particular, or significantly also in the more conservative areas which used to be Erdogan's strongholds. And in this particular moment, the PKK is laying down their arms and declaring peaceful, democratic coexistence. Where's the democracy in Turkey?
Yeah.
And how did we end up here?
How did we get here?
Yeah.
Yeah. To highlight what you just said, the social economic conditions in Turkey are terrible for the working class. They're suffering, real suffering. Inflation is much, much higher than anything we've experienced here in Western Europe, let's say. The people are really suffering. And finally, Erdogan has reached the end of that wave that he was riding because he rode a wave in the past.
Yeah.
In effect, he's anticipated some of the phenomenon we're seeing today.
Yes.
The Le Pens, the AfD, the Trumps. He's a similar figure that came up against the old established Kemalist establishment and emerged representing a certain wing of the business class, let's say, in Turkey. Well, he's reached the limits because even he, he's not a miracle man. He cannot solve the problems of capitalism, and the people of Turkey are suffering.
Yeah.
And it's a tragedy, actually, that the anger of the masses in Turkey is finding a political expression, at least on the electoral front, through the CHP, which is not a party that represents the workers of Turkey. It's a bourgeois outfit. But it's like when there's nothing else, you vote for whatever way you can to get rid of the one you have in power. They want to get rid of Erdogan because he now is connected with the social economic situation we have in Turkey.
Yeah.
In this situation, it's interesting to see the evolution of the PKK. It's not just setting up. I've got the whole letter here. He says that I won't read the whole thing. It says it led to the PKK gradually losing its original meaning and beginning to stagnate. Like many other historical movements, it has now reached the end of its life cycle. He's talking about the PKK. And therefore needs to be dissolved. Not just put down the guns, it must dissolve as an organization. And then he talks about, for over a millennium, Turks and Kurds have seen the need to remain in an alliance. Today, the fundamental task is to restore and reorganize this historic relationship. Basically, he's saying, we got to go back to working together, Kurds and Turks. Now, we as Marxists and communists, we're all in favor of the unity of the Kurdish and the Turkish workers. But that's not what's being discussed here. This is about coming back together within the republic, as he refers to, which is the republic that Erdogan is the leader of.
Yes.
It's a complete capitulation to the ruling class of Turkey. Now, the question is this. You remember we had discussions years ago about these ideas that Öcalan had started to take on. The way I see it is this. Look, they're obviously rooted in what they define as Marxism-Leninism. In reality, it's more like a Stalinist tradition. You see, whatever you can say about Stalinism, there's a lot of people see it as a radical alternative, etc. We mustn't forget that one of the central ideas is two-stagism, and the first stage is the bourgeois democratic revolution, which we must support. And therefore, you look for progressive elements within the bourgeois society or the pre-capitalist society, whatever. And that they came from that idea, and illusions in the Soviet Union, that model. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, you could see what happened. Confusion reigned amongst a lot of these people because the model, the idea that they'd looked to had collapsed. Öcalan gets arrested and then is in prison, and he does a lot of reading. And I looked at he read the works of a guy called Murray Bookchin, an American anarchist who I'd never heard of, not a particularly important figure, I would say, from a theoretical point of view, but he developed his ideas about communalism, municipal politics, etc. And the Öcalan, from reading those works of this American anarchist, came up with the idea of democratic confederalism, i.e. local politics. You fight for your rights locally, etc. If you remember at the time, Hamid, when we were in the other office, or we were in the basement office, we discussed all this, and we saw in it, this is a way of basically abandoning the idea of a Kurdistan of all the Kurdish peoples, i.e. the southeast of Turkey, the northeast of Syria, the northern part of Iraq, parts of Iran, etc. Bringing the Kurd, they're the biggest nation without a state on the planet, apparently. There's over
Yes.
40, 50 million of them.
Yes.
And they don't have their own country. They're all minorities within other countries
Yes.
and oppressed minorities
Yes.
for decades. Now, it was a justified struggle they had. Now, in this idea of confederalism, municipalism, and all the rest of it, the way I see it is this has prepared the present situation. By promoting these ideas, he's abandoned the struggle for the Kurds for Kurdistan, and he's turning back in Turkey towards collaboration with the establishment.
because democratic confederalism, he said, "Oh, we don't agree with the old state model."
That's
of
right.
Things, but it also meant that
And nationalization, things like that.
That de facto, they didn't challenge the old state. So the Turkish states wasn't challenged. Oh, we don't need to. We can just have our own little councils in Turkey. And what they did actually in municipal elections in Turkey, they tried to set up something similar to their system. But in Syria, they set up these councils that would run, and they had each one a male chair and a female chair, and they were supposed to be much more progressive than everything else. But in all of these, and in Iraq and Iran, they didn't really have that much of a base. But they didn't, except for Shingal, of course, in Iraq. But they didn't actually challenge any of those states. And the whole idea was to say to the ruling classes of those countries, "We're not a threat to you. We can collaborate." That's why they said to the Americans, "Look, we're not a threat to anything. We just want." Our little communes here. He said to Erdogan, we're not a threat to you. Even though Erdogan was waging a civil war against the Kurds.
In Turkey and in Syria. Yeah. The bombing of the Kurds in Syria by the Turks.
Exactly.
But it brings out the limits of the theory that he adopted. And it indicated a direction of travel of the leaders of the PKK, in particular, Öcalan. And look at what's happening now in Syria with the new regime that's come to power, which is de facto a puppet of Turkey. Trump wants to get out of Syria. It's clear. He doesn't want this. He's got troops in the northeast, and he wants to pull out. The Turks would like the Americans to leave, and the Turks would like to sort out the Kurdish problem in Turkey and in Syria. And in Turkey, Öcalan is collaborating on this, turning the attentions of the Kurds inwards into Turkey, and talking about the Democratic Republic and all the rest of it. Where's the Democratic Republic, by the way, in Turkey?
Yeah.
Where's even the bourgeois democracy?
Yeah.
But in Syria, it's having a similar effect. The deal they're trying to get in Syria is the borders are going to be should be under the control of the Damascus government, i.e. Jolani, the HTS that have come to power. The armed units of the northeast, of this autonomous region, should be integrated into the national army with some rights for the Kurds. There's been recently an exchange of prisoners. They're discussing. There's a bit of a dilemma there because the Kurds obviously would like their military units to remain intact as Kurdish, or let's call it northeastern units within the army. Jolani would like them to dissolve and be part of the army under a common discipline, i.e. remove the armed bodies of the Kurds in the northeast. But they've fallen to the level where the leader of this region, the Kurdish leader, has called on the Americans to stay, basically appealing to American imperialism for their own, they call it security, right? The deal they're trying to make is you can be secure by integrating into the state, becoming part of the Syrian state, in effect. And I'm asking myself, where's the Rojava experiment gone? I can remember when it was very popular on the left. And there were elements there. I mean, when you saw those women, the fighting women, the units, there was a genuine democracy at that level. There's a genuine progressive element to the whole situation there. But the problem is this, you see, they abandon the idea of socialism and, nationalization in the classic sense, i.e., that's old Marxism, put that to one side. All this communalism, which wasn't clear what it meant in terms of capitalism. But it looked like one of the most revolutionary places on the planet you could go. And there were people going there. Look, I found an interesting interview with a couple of activists published last year. Two of them who are sort of active and experts, journalists, etc. They would comment on this last year in January, long before all these recent developments. And one of them is quoted as saying this: "I met several international volunteers who went to Rojava to support the movement on the ground, who were rather disappointed by what they saw when they got there because of all those rosy accounts they had read before they decided to make the trip." Now, this is an activist talking, who supports, obviously, the Kurds here. She talks about the communes that have been created. They try to act on this theory, the communes. But she says this: "But in reality, it's very easy to observe that the participation of the people in these communes is rather low, or it's not high enough for these bodies, for these mechanisms to become the main decision-making units." But she says, interesting, other stuff. It's I already mentioned that the economic situation is a big factor in the Northeast. People have to get more than one job just to feed their families. You don't even have time to engage in politics on such an intimate level. So people are just struggling to survive in the economic conditions that prevail there. She talks about the attempts to democratize the economy and to eliminate monopolies, but in reality, it says the only option they have is to continue providing the population with basic goods and services through the black market, through other means. They've not been able to change society in the Northeast because you can't have. Not only can you not have socialism in one country, you can't have socialism in one region, or even worse, you can't have socialism in one municipality. Now, the tragedy of all this is this: the Kurds, if they'd had a revolutionary communist position, revolutionary, genuine Marxist position in Turkey, they could have approached the Turkish working class from a class point of view, with the need to change Turkish society, to overthrow capitalism in Turkey. And now, with the present conditions that are developing in Turkey, there would be room for such a force. And just at the moment when that's beginning to happen, they're saying disarm and dissolve, right? Yeah. And in Syria, they're being made to force deals with these Islamists who've just come to power. It shows you the limits of the ideas that stood behind this movement. And when it emphasizes something, I'll finish on this. When we say theory is important, it's actually key to a revolutionary organization.
Yes.
Here is an example where serious theoretical mistakes have now led to very big, real material problems on the ground. Yeah. Where instead of playing the role you could have played, you're in retreat in a moment where leadership is required. This is the tragedy of the situation. And what is required is to build that alternative. And it applies to Trump in America. We need a political force that can explain the question of protectionism, free trade, what it means, and what a genuine workers' alternative would be. We need a force like that in France not to support the bourgeois liberals in their maneuvers. And if you want to fight the right wing, you fight with a revolutionary opposition, not by cozying up to the bourgeois liberals. And in Turkey and Syria, the same thing applies. Yeah. We need a force that can give a real expression to the anger of the Turkish workers, not the CHP, which is not doing it. And the same applies to Syria. Everywhere, the same tragedy is being played out. The lack of a revolutionary leadership of the working class. It's a big task, but that is really the most urgent task today, is to build that force.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect way to end it, Fred. I think that's the message we see everywhere. It's a question of leadership and a class approach. once you lose that compass of a class approach to politics, then you see that in France with the left who are sliding up behind the establishment. You see in Turkey where the PKK, the leadership of the PKK, the standard bearer of radicalism
That's right.
in Turkey for decades, are rallying up behind the Erdogan, the semi-authoritarian, semi-Bonapartist ruler of Turkey, right at the time where millions of people are taking to the streets looking for a way out, leaving those people in the hands of the liberal CHP reactionaries, just like the left's behavior in France is leaving people in the hands of
Le Pen.
People like Le Pen.
That's right.
I think we can end it there. This is a conversation that will continue. Thank you very much, Fred. For all of you out there, thank you very much for tuning in. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to our videos and podcasts wherever you see it. And we will be back again next week, Thursday at 6 p.m. UK time.